session of class, there are duties imposed on boards, and there are consequences for certain actions that boards take that aren't in alignment with the mission of an organization. But I was really interested after taking corporate law to see how, if at all, these accountability mechanisms function in court. So I'm going to give a little roadmap here. And just briefly, I wanted to share with the non-JDs how I got a lot of the research in this, because I think it's a really helpful thing for policy students and something that I don't think we're taught. There's great search engines called Lexis, Westlaw. Bloomberg also has one that provide access to a bunch of legal cases. I think most universities have a subscription, but it's really helpful to get the guiding case law or secondary materials on if you're looking at a legal issue. The other thing that's even easier to access is Cornell's Legal Information Institute, which I believe has every federal statute and a brief explanation of what they are, a lot of common law terms, just like a really helpful grounding in a topic if you want a paragraph or two introduction, and it's great for definitions. So I'm just going to be going over the challenges of accountability, what the standards are that nonprofits are held to, and then go into the mechanisms for holding them accountable in court, including derivative suit and suit by state attorneys general in this case, which is something unique to the nonprofit setting effectively that isn't found in the corporate world. And then go into some examples of where this has and hasn't worked. And then lastly, I want to look at some alternative accountability mechanisms that occur out of court and provide some recommendations for how we keep our boards accountable. At the core of this issue, I think we have the concern that we have, there's a great quote on the slide, I'm not going to read it, but basically we have these positions that we hold the public trust in board members to make sure that nonprofits are doing the right thing and helping citizens achieve goals, be productive socially, take care of the environment. And we should hold these directors to a higher standard, perhaps, than people who are just trying to make profits. At the same time, these are unpaid positions. There's generally less you can do to grift from a nonprofit than a corporation. And a lot of these people are good people who are doing things with their lives and trying to make a difference. So there's this balance that needs to be maintained between holding people to a higher standard and making sure that nonprofits are accountable and people are guiding them in the right direction at the same time as not pushing people away and punishing them for trying to go above and beyond in their careers and make a difference. I think sorry, I want to make sure I didn't skip a slide here. A good place to start with looking at what accountability entails in court is a review of the duties of nonprofit directors. And there's three primary ones. There's a couple different ways to split it, but I found this framework the most helpful. And I'll run through these because we already did discuss these in class. The first is the duty of care, which is probably the most important. It means don't be negligent, remain attentive, act in a manner that's a director reasonably believes is in the best interest of a corporation. Just do your due diligence. The duty of loyalty is also important. That's basically avoiding self-dealing. It's, I think, pretty self-explanatory and not where the meat of the concerns are. And then lastly, the duty of obedience is unique to the nonprofit realm. And there's a little litigation on this, but basically it got eliminated in the corporate sphere because the obedience just was the profit motive and it kind of fell under care and loyalty. But here, this is actually where some board members are held accountable because there's a duty of obedience to the mission of the nonprofit organization. So I found that interesting that this kind of still exists, even though it's archaic in the other parts of comparable corporate law. I think the general rationale behind upholding these duties in boards is to prevent the violations that undermine public trust and the goodwill necessary to support the sector. So these are really important that board members are following these bare minimum duties. In connection with duty, you also have to look at the legal standard. How do we tell if someone has violated a duty? And this basically comes down to negligence. You can do worse, you can be reckless, you can be actively in opposition of the duty, which often may be the case with the duty of loyalty where you're stealing. But negligence is kind of the lowest standard. And that's defined as a failure to behave with a level of care someone in that position would have exercised under the same circumstances. This is called the reasonable person standard, and it's qualified in the corporate setting. Most people use Delaware because it's where a massive amount of litigation happens, where a massive amount of corporations are headquartered, and has a really good court system to work through these issues. And they, along with, I think, every state, has a business judgment rule, which is the courts acknowledging that we don't want to get involved in the inner workings of a corporation. We believe that's best for the corporation to do. So what they say is, we're going to have this negligence standard, but we hold that a person in a directorship or as a CEO is going to make business judgments in good faith, as a reasonably prudent person would do, and that this director is acting in the best interest of the corporation. It's basically a pass to say there may be some weird things that they're doing to make profits, but we're going to let this happen. We're going to let businesses take risks. And this applies in the nonprofit setting as well, that there's effectively a business judgment rule for nonprofit directors. And this is where it gets complicated, because you have a situation where the law gives everyone a pass, except for incredibly egregious activities by directors. Everything is going to be considered within the scope of advancing the nonprofit's mission. So this is the meat of the challenge. To hold directors accountable if they err or if they are negligent is quite difficult to prove, because the standard is so lenient. One way to hold corporations accountable, basically the only mechanism. There are also shareholder proposals that are very weak, but basically the only mechanism, if a corporation is being swindled or someone is not taking their duty of care seriously in the board, is for a shareholder to file a derivative suit, which means they're suing on behalf of the corporation, because the corporation cannot sue itself if the directors are messing up, because that's kind of where the power lies, and who's considered the corporation. So the plaintiff is a shareholder acting on behalf of the corporation, not on behalf of the plaintiff. Defendants are often directors and corporate officers accused of malfeasance. And if the plaintiff wins, the proceeds returned to the corporation. Is a bit of an interesting legal twist, but effectively it's the singular check on malfeasance at the board level that's actually actively employed in litigation against corporations. So they have to petition. A shareholder must first petition the officers, say, you're doing something wrong, fix it. If they don't do it, they may proceed with a suit. So that's the mechanism, and basically where it ends in corporate law, that this is how remedies are achieved if board members are negligent. There's two main issues with this when applying it to the nonprofit world, where this is really interesting. First, it's unclear who has a standing to sue for a nonprofit, because we don't have a defined set of shareholders. As we've talked about, there's a ton of different people who could be considered shareholders, from employees to clients to the donor base. So it's really unclear who could even get into court if they wanted to bring a derivative suit against a negligent board member. You also have a bunch of states that have tried to deal with this. North Carolina has one such example, is fairly generic, called the Nonprofit Corporations Act, which allows these same derivative proceedings to take place. It's usually donors who will bring these suits, but you can interpret this liberally. And I think there are arguments, at least in North Carolina, where I looked this up, where you can have, it's not necessarily just donors. There can be clients who can bring the suit on behalf of the nonprofit. The other issue, though, is going back to this business judgment rule, is how can a board member be said to have violated a duty when so many actions can be considered good faith efforts at performing the duty, especially when you not only have the profit incentive is a singular incentive in the corporate world. Here we have following the mission, which is even more nebulous. So really what this effectively means is that the only the directors that I've found to be held accountable are ones who are just grossly negligent to the point they clearly don't care about their duties. And that's clearly not everything that should be held accountable. There can be bad decisions made that probably hurt a nonprofit that really there's no mechanism to hold the nonprofit accountable there. These are both big concerns. So while these general derivative suits do exist, the far more common alternative to sue like negligent board members, is through suit by state attorneys general. And this is the same way in which state attorney general often go after in labor and employment issues. They'll go after employers who are violating state labor laws, like systematically, instead of having each individual worker bring it. So this is found in other areas of the law, but it's fairly unique here because it's not typically found against corporations. There's two kinds of models where this can work. There's this strong model, which is based on the Attorney General's role in overseeing public charity. This was one of kind of the ideas inherent in the Attorney General's powers. In the same way the Inspector Generals oversee government agencies and make sure there isn't mismanagement there. This, at the same time, even these strong models with a lot of power in the Attorney General to sue typically don't allow, don't have the Attorney General be the only person who can sue. You can always have a derivative suit from a stakeholder. There's a great California example of this. There's also a weaker model. The state I found where it has a weaker model is Connecticut, where you can really narrowly construe the Attorney General's role to just represent the public interest. They often lack statutory authority, as in Tennessee. So you have to kind of go on this common law idea of what the Attorney General's role is. It's not a super important distinction. Basically, they can sue. They can act as the stakeholder suing on behalf of the public. A lot of the successful suits are coming out of blue states, perhaps unsurprisingly. Really quickly, there's a couple of interesting examples, and there's very few of them, so perhaps not surprisingly. One from New York in 2009 found that the Attorney General can, when this foundation was taking tens of thousands of dollars in government grants and then not expensing them out and not filing, the Attorney General took them to court and successfully recovered, made them file the expense reports. It's a rare example. The other thing, and that was actually a business corporation. I couldn't even find a nonprofit, but it's functionally the same because they have this expanded mission that they can, the directors can pursue. The other example is from California, where one of the board members of the Museum of Contemporary Art had completely fallen down on the job, just like wasn't responding, and the California Attorney General successfully sued and removed the board member. Two examples, I chose the same state here because it was interesting. Two examples from Pennsylvania to compare a success, a relative success, and a relative failure of enforcement against a negligent or actively hostile board. The first is this Conneaut Lake State Lake Park, which is an amusement park close to Erie, Pennsylvania. And for a long time, they had been effectively run down. They really weren't doing much. This was just a small nonprofit that did not have a lot of funds. The Attorney General eventually, after two fires in 2008 and 2013, sued the park for breaches in fiduciary duty of just general maintenance. They weren't keeping the park maintained. It burned down twice. They found a liability of almost $1 million that they imputed onto the board members because they were negligent in their duty of care. And the relief sought was basically, we need a new board. So they asked for the board members to be replaced. They entered into negotiations for this $1 million in the new board, and ended up basically just replacing all the board members under a settlement. So it didn't get to court. That's fairly common across the board. But I think especially in these suits where you're not really interested in the money, there's not money to be had, money to be made in a lot of these, especially for nonprofits that are burning to the ground because of a lack of maintenance. So I think that was actually a settlement that I would be unsurprised if they were pretty happy about that. However, in the follow-up, I found interesting that there's allegations of bankruptcy mismanagement, the fire proceeds being grifted. So clearly this didn't solve their underlying issues. But there was enforcement and the board did change. A sadder example comes out of the Penn State scandal with Sandusky. And this was, just for a little bit of background, in June 2012, Sandusky, who is a coach on the football team, was convicted of 45 counts of rape and endangerment. This had been going on for years and years. And a special investigative counsel for the board of Penn State, which I found out is actually a nonprofit. There's a lot of public universities that are set up with a board of regents system, but this is actually a nonprofit university. But the board had the special investigative counsel find the board negligent. This is outside the court. This is just convened by the state, and found the executives, Joe Paterno, who is the coach, and the president of Penn State, Graham Spanier, among those who created a hostile environment and allowed these these rapes to occur from 1998 to 2001, and then again in 2011. When allegations surfaced, they were stymied. The board didn't act on them. This seems like an ideal place for the Attorney General to come in, but they did not. There was public pressure on them to fire the president and Coach Paterno, and both were eventually fired. But there was never any suit against the board or individual members. One trustee resigned in 2012. That's the only change in management, or not change in, excuse me, a change in the board that came from this situation. It occurred, clearly more trauma occurred because the board was negligent and nothing really happened. There was some public shaming, but there weren't actual legal ramifications for the board members to be negligent in making sure that the president kept, listened to these allegations and took them seriously. This brings me to kind of figuring out, if the legal system is kind of routinely failing us, where else can we hold board members accountable, and what other ways? The first is public pressure, and you did see this in Penn State, that the public pressure was what pushed out the executives. Clients, employees, managers, donors can all pressure the board to take action. Another way to do this is through board election. This is more of a self-governance mechanism, but if the board, who believes they're doing the right thing, sees that some members are falling down on their duties or not engaged, or committing fraud, they can, call elections and force out these individual members. It's less of a function when, but less of a functional alternative when the entire board is rotten or not paying attention. Bylaws for accountability can also help. These can be implemented on a case-by-case basis and basically say, these are our best practices for when we believe there's grift happening, when we believe that someone is not doing their due diligence before each board meeting, require more regular elections. You could have bylaws requiring outside input into board decisions by stakeholders. There's a ton of different mechanisms here that under a best practices could be put in and change the culture of a board. Then lastly, I think diversity, as we all know, reduces groupthink, passivity. It just doesn't stand for the collective acceptance of a lower standard of oversight. So getting rid of that old boys club mentality might have really changed things at Penn State, for example. A couple more mechanisms. I know I'm close on time here, but generally disclosure could help. In the for-profit world, there's conflict of interest disclosures are mandated. You could have a version of this where interested board members are required to abstain from decisions in the nonprofit context. This is, again, mostly for duty of loyalty violations. Another interesting thing that was raised in one article that I found was staff the board with major donors. Even though this is a concern in other places, this actually eliminates an agency issue that if the donors are the ones making decisions, they may want their money to be better used than people who don't have the financial stake in the system. So I'm not sure I can advocate for that one entirely, but it's an interesting byproduct, positive byproduct of a different problem. And then the IRS also has the capacity to revoke 501c status from an organization. They don't really use this as a threat in theory, but as we discussed, that's not happening now. But it could be used as a stronger incentive to have functioning boards, and can be used as a lever by attorneys general who are pressuring boards to do the right thing, to say, well, we're going to contact the IRS and inform them about what's going on in this case. So in conclusion, my big takeaway recommendations to address this problem of keeping shareholders accountable, but also not pushing people away from doing this for nonprofits, or to bolster the state attorney general's offices to investigate and bring suit. I think that's underutilized. In some states, it's not utilized despite being on the books. Second, diversification of boards, just keeping people engaged and coming from different perspectives is really important. And then third, if we're going to go out there in the world and eventually be board members at places, make sure not to fall down on our duties, because so much of it relies on the individuals who are part of the board to do the right thing. So I think that's everything.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. So if you unshare, yeah, there we go. Fabulous. Thank you. So, and we're holding questions until the end. So, Philmon?
All right, perfect. I'll get started.
Sorry, just a question. Are we supposed to change to a new form for the input then? Okay. Just
You
need a
don't
minute
have to, as long
to
as you
save.
signify on the form who it's
Okay.
for. I guess I'm just going to cut and paste. So whatever works for you. You can do a new form, or you can, as long as it's clear which one it is. Delmon, can you share? Are you okay to?
Yeah, can you all see my shared screen now or no?
No, you've gone off screen, but we can't see the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Try this then.
There you go.
Is it working now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, perfect.
There's no, well, it's there now. It's working.
Oh, perfect. Great. You all should be seeing a slide that says, "What's philanthropy got to do with it?"
Got it.
Perfect. All right, I will get started. My presentation is going to be on sort of how philanthropy and democracy sort of interact, and how philanthropy can undermine or enhance democracy. And the title of the presentation is just a shout out to any Tina Turner fans. I'll go here. Here's just a quick roadmap. It's going to be kind of a bit fast, but I'm going to go through some definitions and ground setting and sort of why we're talking about these topics. And then I'm going to run through about sort of like 100 years of sort of philanthropic giving. That's going to cover sort of a bit of a historical background and efforts to regulate philanthropy. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of mechanisms that philanthropy can through which philanthropy can undermine democracy and how it can enhance it. And I'll leave with some concluding thoughts about solutions. So I'll hop right into definitions. This is just sort of setting the stage in terms of why we're talking about what we're talking about. We know that the nonprofit sector is a huge and important part of our social fabric, but it's also a really important part of our economic fabric in our country as well. It's about 1 in 10 jobs in the private sector, and here at home in New Jersey, it's about has a little over 250,000 nonprofit jobs, and then just the inestimable sort of multiplicative effects of its economic impact. So thinking about sort of the wages paid to staff, and they spend that money in the community vendors that they use. So this is just to sort of lay the stage into why this is an important section to be talking about. Just it has a very powerful economic impact. I'm mostly going to be talking about foundations because they serve as an important source of philanthropic funding, like we learned last week. And I'm just going to use this definition of philanthropy as sort of the operating definition. Another one that I found really persuasive was sort of the private redistribution of wealth accumulated through for-profit means, but distributed through nonprofit personalities or organizations. I thought that was a very persuasive definition, but I'm just going to use this one because it's more, it's from the textbook, and I thought that was a little more interesting. And then democracy here, I just want to be clear when I talk about what do I mean by democracy. It's sort of, I'm not talking about a particular system of government, but rather sort of that sort of small d democracy, equal participation, participatory government, equal voice under the law, that type of democracy. A lot of this stuff is intuitive, but I just wanted to just lay the groundwork here. So I'm going to jump into the historical background. So philanthropy is about as old as time. It started, but the philanthropy we know today is very recent. So philanthropy started as very small, very private, fragmented, and predominantly religious. But it wasn't until sort of the Gilded Age, which is sort of this, the time period after the Civil War into the early 1900s, where we have this sort of hyper wealthy industrialist class that sort of accumulated unprecedented amounts of wealth. This was initially, so historians are saying initially weren't necessarily influenced by tax policy because the 16th Amendment or the Income Tax Amendment wasn't really enacted until the early 20th century. So basically the early sort of motivational factors of why this sort of sector emerged or big philanthropy emerged was sort of a genuine sense of altruism, desire for prestige, and that sort of social status and influence that comes with being able to transform these social institutions. But of course, as laws change, incentives change over time as well. So you have the passage of the 16th Amendment, you have the first sort of modern income tax, and then you have towards the end of the Gilded Age and sort of turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, you have more sort of opportunities for reductions for charitable giving. And what I've understood is that at the time, this shouldn't have been interpreted as encouraging people to give, but rather it was to discourage people who were already giving to stop giving. So they didn't want people to stop, because there was this prevailing idea that there was this sort of one-to-one equivalency of foundation spending on social charitable purposes and like government social spending. So basically, politicians were thinking that well, it's sort of, you kind of have this one-to-one equivalency, and we don't want to stop them because then those costs are going to be passed on to the government. So that's where sort of the rationale for charitable giving wasn't really to sort of inspire sort of mass philanthropy or things like that. It was mostly to sort of avoid taking on this social spending, where at least that was sort of the prevailing political thought. And some politicians even thought that foundations were better at it, that there were these sort of transactional costs that that governments needed to do, transactional costs that involved government doing things, and that the foundations were more effective, that the end user would end up getting more value. That's what we told this sort of century of foundation growth, which is what I call sort of the 20th century. This growth was particularly meteoric after the Second World War, where sort of these big philanthropists figured out they could gift these corporate stocks to avoid capital gains tax, and then that money given away while alive also reduced estate taxes. So when taxes went up a great deal and during World War II to fund defense costs, basically it became apparent that they could save more in taxation by giving their money to their tax-exempt foundations. So then these foundations just mushroomed. Between 1900 and 1939, around 571 foundations were formed, but between 1940 and 1959, so that time period during the war and the decade after the war, about from 4,000 foundations were formed. And these numbers are conservative because there wasn't a lot of information on early foundations. And the Congress kept on, there was a lot of congressional support for them. They kept on increasing the amount of deductible for charitable giving. And again, this sort of prevailing belief that it was cost effective for a government, that sort of one-to-one equivalency of government social spending to foundation spending, and foundations continued sort of to grow in the 20th century. And this is just sort of a more graphical representation of what I was saying. You sort of just see during these different time periods in the 40s, World War I, Korean War in the 50s, these are all time periods where the taxes were high, defense costs were high, and we see the rise of these large foundations emerging during these time periods. Now, it's not like there were always sort of just these things that were sort of beyond sort of scrutiny. There were efforts to rein them in, but they were met with tremendous backlash. So there was the War Revenues Act of 1917 during World War I, where the government was trying to raise revenue, and they limited the deductibility of charitable contributions. This received a ton of backlash. Charities, universities were all against this sort of change. They're testifying in Congress, and that continued into the 30s with the Revenue Act, the debates around the Revenue Act in 1939. The University of Pennsylvania university presidents were testifying before Congress against these limits. And then in 1952, they ended up succeeding in sort of increasing it to 20%, the deductibility of for charitable contributions, and then that led to more pressure, and then they got it up to 30% in 1954, 2 years later. And again, but there was sort of, people were still trying to sort of narrow the scope of sort of what activities or what charitable giving they could deduct it for, but still they were still able to sort of increase that limit, and then continued lobbying led to it being around 50% in 1969. So again, it's like one of the early reasons why it failed is that there was a lot of backlash against it. And then there was another sort of rise of sort of increased sort of nonprofit scrutiny. And that was sort of during the Red Scare in the 1960s. And that prompted a lot of investigations into large foundations. And oftentimes people who were against the influence of foundations would use this as sort of a pretext to investigate large foundations. There were never any sort of discoveries of sort of pro-communist activities in foundations, but they did discover a lot of other insidious activities. They discovered that the donors had a lot of power inside of these foundations. They had a lot of social influence, which had political implications. and allowed them particularly to be vehicles to park stocks, and for companies, for rich people or rich hyper wealthy industrialists to sort of maintain this sort of dynastic control of their companies by making large stock gifts to their own foundations. So it's actually really interesting. A survey in 1982 found that half of the largest foundations established between 1940 and 1969, again, these time periods where there were wars happening, where there were a lot of taxes, a lot of those largest foundations were begun with gifts of stocks large enough to control a firm. So again, this was just sort of revealing how the wealthy were using these foundations as financial instruments to maintain control of their corporations. There's a lot of conflict of interest type of issues that were discovered, that they were paying, you could pay family members large salaries and allowing them to benefit from these charitable deductions. So this led to a lot of controversy, which led to the 1969 Tax Reform Act. And this is sort of the seminal sort of legislation over nonprofits, where a lot of the sort of modern day terminology around the payout requirements, that kind of stuff sort of emerged. So that required increased transparency over financial documents, increased payout requirement, created a payout requirement from foundations of 5%, imposed a 4% excise tax, among other things. That excise tax was actually reduced later due to lobbying in the 70s. But then this was just that watershed moment where a lot of legislation, a lot of increased scrutiny over foundation activities. So then why did this all slow down? Again, so we talked about sort of the backlash that was happening at the time. There was this sort of zealous congressperson named Wilbur Mills, who was a very powerful chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. He was sort of leading the charge. He was supposed to be one of the ones leading the charge of new tax reforms that were supposed to affect the that were supposed to affect nonprofits, but he abruptly left political life because he was found intoxicated a few times with an Argentine burlesque dancer, and that sort of disrupted the movement of increased tax reform, and that sort of shifted after he left, sort of shifted the priorities in Congress. But something that did happen during this time period was sort of this paradigm shift, that foundations were no longer seen as this sort of complement to government or a substitute for government, but then that the scrutiny led to sort of this understanding that what we're doing, we're subsidizing. These were subsidies that the government was providing, and there wasn't this sort of one-to-one equivalency anymore. So then essentially, this inspired sort of a new sort of area of research in a really unstudied sector, because there wasn't a lot of data on how these foundations operated or on their finances. Not surprisingly, philanthropists were the ones that really stepped in to sort of provide that research in that space. But basically, this is sort of a very brief sort of history of sort of how this emerged, but then what kind of backlash happened when Congress or other sort of actors tried to rein in their influence. And so why is this important, right? So there are a lot of mechanisms through which philanthropy can undermine democracy. One of the ways that they had talked about in the 60s, and still an issue today, is sort of the social influence aspect. Foundations have a lot of control, can compel, I guess, the speech of their grantee nonprofits. So these nonprofits may self-censor out of a fear of losing funds. And if you think that a democracy relies on free, equal participation and informed citizenry, this has a lot of implications if the wealthy individuals can amplify their own speech or coerce speech to shift public opinion, right? And we see this in Robert Reich, which is one of the authors that we read earlier in the semester, writes a lot on this topic. He talks about his own experiences of speaking at places and being asked not to criticize the wealthy or criticize Wall Street because so-and-so organization was afraid of antagonizing some of their wealthier patrons. He mentions think tanks that release reports on inequality, but do they downplay the role that these corporations can have. So if you're thinking about a democracy relies on sort of informed citizenry, and you have this small group of people sort of shaping and sculpting, which is why I have the picture of the sculptor there, public opinion, then this really is going to influence the way people participate in our sort of social life and our democratic life here. Then you have another big issue, which is democratic allocation of public money, right? So the hyper wealthy can direct these tax funded causes which they see fit, and they're not really held accountable for these decisions, but we still subsidize them. And this caused the taxpayer, or will cause the taxpayer, around $50 to $56 billion in 2021. This money would otherwise have been allocated via the appropriations process through our elected officials, which is supposed to be, I guess, theoretically the expression of our democratic allocation money, but these individuals can, I think one philanthropist actually captured it very well in a report that I read. He was basically saying that, you know, like the tax benefits incentivize them to give a lot of money, and otherwise he would have otherwise paid that money in taxes. And he said it in a way that I forgot the exact quote, but it was sort of, he was saying that if when I give to my foundation, I decide where the money goes. If I pay taxes, the government decides where the money goes. And the government in this situation would be sort of the people, because this is a democratically elected government. So that's sort of that undemocratic allocation of resources is also another problem here. Then you have the attitudes of the rich are very different. So these are just sort of different indicators that I picked from a few research that I talked about how the rich and the poor experience the world differently. And this can actually affect their policy implications. I mean, even there was some physiological stuff here, how the poor experience more stress as well. They experience financial insecurity differently. And this can have implications for policy as well. One big thing that a lot of folks might remember is that in the mid-2000s, or even today, right, Bill Gates is a very strong proponent of education reform in the country, where LA Times sort of reporter sort of satirically called him the superintendent of the American schools. So he had this campaign to reduce American high school sizes and breaking up big high schools across the country. So in that decade between 2000 and 2009, he was able to marshal $2 billion and affected sort of the lives of around 8% of the nation's public high schools. Ultimately, this sort of breaking down of high schools, the experiment didn't work. And to his credit, he acknowledged that. But the outsized impact that one person could have on policy without any external review is mind-boggling, right? And one article even pointed out that Bill Gates is able to marshal more resources, financial resources, than the Department of Education in terms of discretionary money. So like in terms of the department, basically it was talking about how the Department of Education doesn't have a lot of money to spend in a discretionary fashion to fund these sort of innovative ideas, but Bill Gates could do it without any kind of external review, and he might be out of touch with what many Americans believe. Like he's a big proponent of other types of educational reforms, but these education reform or one type of education, for example, charter schools, doesn't have a lot of broad congressional support. So wealthy people can fund a lot of money into these ideas with very little external review, and they might be out of touch with society. So this is also an important aspect of it, that they experience the world differently. Their policy priorities are going to be different than ours as well. But it's not all bad, right? Like I want to just give them some credit. I'm a Washingtonian. I directly benefit from Bill Gates's generosity. I went to the University of Washington. He gives a lot of money to the university. So I want to acknowledge that this isn't all bad, right? They fund innovation, right? So despite that experiment not working, they fund and pilot a lot of really great ideas. So charities have a problem. They don't have access to a lot of credit, right? So banks are going to be reluctant to give to nonprofits, right? So philanthropic funding is really important for incubating and launching innovative ideas. And some of these ideas end up holding the government accountable, right? Which enhances democracy, and the extending credit, creates more participation, which is good for that sort of small d democracy. Some examples of this are the Ford Foundation, all the community grants that they give, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, they have a lot of voter registration, voter engagement, voting rights. The Democracy Fund has this public square program where they encourage press freedom. So again, sort of shedding light on different issues, encouraging participation for people that might have been left out of these processes. So these nonprofits or these foundations have a big role in also promoting sort of democratic participation and conversations in our country. So what are we supposed to do with all this information, right? So these are some thoughts here that I had in the last minute and a half or so that I have. We could strictly begin to limit the ability of foundations to sort of lobby or engage in sort of politically, because they have a lot of sort of leniency in terms of the way they engage in society and in sort of our political system. There are some guardrails, but we could try to limit them even more. And this was actually in a conversation that I had with Professor Rubin, and in class, we talked about sort of how if you begin to sort of blanket limit the ability of these 501c3 foundations to sort of engage, then you might be actually snuffing out a lot of, or crowding out a lot of people who might have very positive ideas. And at the same time, it becomes regressive because then there's a lot of hyperwealthy can still lobby through their for-profit personality. So this becomes a very sticky issue, right? So solutions to these problems are very hard to sort of strike a right, correct balance. Another thing we could try to do is around donor transparency, try to figure out who is donating to these organizations. And they are required by law to make this information available to the IRS, but a lot of these documents are confidential. They tried in New York to try to mandate that these become publicly available, but then it was struck down by the courts, I think, for having too broad of a mandate. The legal rationale, I'm sure some of the JD students can probably tell you more about the legal rationale for it. But there's a lot of pushback. So again, you're sort of experiencing a lot of this sort of, these issues are very sticky. And when you try to sort of engage in them or try to take some corrective action, there's a lot of pushback against it by a very established philanthropic sort of class of people in our country. But anyways, these are very sticky solutions, and I really wanted to save time in Q&A for that. I'm exactly at 20 minutes, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Awesome. So we're going to move to Clark. And do you want to just go ahead and share? This is like speed information overload, right? Like you're getting a big infusion of information about all this really cool stuff. I feel like we should get extra course credit for all these.
Sorry, okay, I was on mute. Are you all seeing my screen? Okay, hi everyone. So today I'll be talking about mutual aid, solidarity, not charity. So here's an overview of my presentation. First, I'll be talking about the relevance of mutual aid in the age of COVID-19 and the landscape, the radical roots of mutual aid, the relationship between mutual aid and nonprofits, which is theorized as like a binary, but in reality isn't. We will have a little case study using Princeton Mutual Aid to talk about fundraising, governance and decision-making, motivating and managing volunteers, and the importance of mission, incorporating mutual aid theory onto the theories that we've already learned in class. Talk briefly about the outlook for the future, and then we'll have questions, I guess, after my presentation. So many of you may have heard about mutual aid more recently, or maybe you already knew about it, but there's definitely an explosion of the practice in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Over 1,000 new mutual aid networks across the country have been started in the last few months. And this is a response to just a combination of like structural inequities that lead to people falling through the cracks, and also literally, you know, CARES Act and other sort of relief for COVID-19 being exclusionary, leaving out communities like sex workers, undocumented folks, and just different marginalized communities that obviously need support in this time. And there have been a lot of new resources and toolkits available online for free that different neighbors and communities can use to start their own mutual aid projects. And a lot of them I use to inform this, this presentation. And here's just a map from one of those websites that shows, it's just like a collective sort of like crowdsourced list of mutual aid. And if you want, you can see if maybe your hometown or community has a mutual aid program started recently. So now on to talk about the radical roots of mutual aid. So mutual aid has a long history in Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities, and it continues in the practice of things you may have heard of, like lending circles, giving circles, and just other mutual aid formations. The images I have here are from the Black Panther Party's survival programs, including free breakfast and health clinics, which you may have heard of. But even as early as the 1700s, free African societies were formed to provide mutual aid to newly free Black people. Professor Rubin also let me know about freedom schools, and there are other models that other immigrant communities have used in times of need in terms of the depression and recession that have just like informed the current moment and created a basic like infrastructure for people to organize within their communities. Many older mutual aid groups have actually been assimilated into private and public institutions, so such as insurance companies and social welfare services. So we may not recognize them as mutual aid groups now. So on to talking about the relationship between mutual aid and nonprofits. It's kind of complicated. Before I get into that though, I wanted to just provide an overview of this concept of the solidarity economy. So this is a framework that focuses on the process of building economic practices and institutions based on the values of equity, cooperation, and solidarity, economic and political democracy, sustainability, pluralism, always really cool things. And this cartoon at the bottom sort of illustrates some of the institutions that would come out of this framework. So like worker-owned cooperatives, community gardens, et cetera. And mutual aid would theoretically be part of this type of economy. And it forms this phrase you often see on mutual aid websites or just like mutual aid materials, or just solidarity, not charity. And I'll get more into that in a bit. Here's like a quick definition of what mutual aid and isn't. There are some sort of like universal tenets, but I also did see some variation in how people define mutual aid, how pure you kind of are in your definition. But it's basically giving and receiving services, resources, support to neighbors, and it's also a space of political education and movement work. And it's not charity, and it's not like a quid pro quo transaction. So that's just like a basic idea of what that looks like. But the next few slides, it's a lot of text, and I highlighted a few things, but I wanted to highlight the work of Dean Spade, who is a mutual aid scholar and abolitionist, and has like created this sort of like list of distinctions, like at a more granular level between mutual aid projects and what is characterized as like a hierarchical, charitable, nonprofit, or social service program. And then as you see, there's an asterisk because it's also the characteristics of mutual aid projects that start to take on the like characteristics of nonprofits. So I highlighted some of the things that are like more relevant to like the readings and discussions we've had in class. So like in nonprofits, members are maybe seen as donors, but in mutual aid, members are just people who make decisions. There's reliance on grants in nonprofits. In mutual aid, you use people power to resist efforts by government to regulate or shut down your work. You know, we've talked about big donors, and in mutual aid, there are open meetings, many people making decisions, right? So these are some distinctions. Another one is establishing and maintaining hierarchies. And then in mutual aid, there's this explicit focus on flattening hierarchies. Often it's 100% volunteer, but if there are paid staff, then it's like really flat wage scale and things like this. And then finally, in nonprofits, we know that there are structures like executive directors and boards, and mutual aid often seeks to do consensus decision-making without these sort of roles and hierarchies. So these are just a few distinctions. I encourage people to read Dean Spade's work on this. I think, I'm actually not sure of pronouns, but I think that they teach like a course on it and everything. So there's a lot of rich work on it. Okay, so as I said, this binary is, I mean, that's a theory, but like in practice, it's more complicated. And mutual aid organizations will often become nonprofits or other entities, and nonprofits will sometimes engage in mutual aid activity. If mutual aid groups do want to incorporate or formalize, they might do it for like reasons of liability protection. So there's a lot of like, there's handling money and bank accounts and like food, and potentially a lot of different people are involved. And so if they want to protect the sort of like formation of the group, they might want to have some sort of entity or formalizing mechanism. But this has the risk of impacting culture, impacting the sort of like pure sort of like tenets and philosophy mutual aid. And also there's just a lot of like corporate formalities and like administrative burdens that are involved in like actually formalizing. But that does depend on the type of entity that the group chooses to be, a nonprofit. And I'm hoping that, you know, what nonprofits are, an LLC, a cooperative corporation, or fiscal sponsorship. So an LLC is like a very common entity type for small businesses. They allow for more flexibility in governance and taxation structure. They don't need to have a board of directors, and they can be structured as co-ops. That's an option. Cooperatives allow groups to more easily raise financing from the community. And they are more flexible than traditional corporations in terms of tax structure as well. And fiscal sponsorship is useful if the mutual aid group is operating on like a temporary basis and like doesn't really have the capacity to handle the administrative demands and like formalities of forming an entity. So those are just some options that mutual aid groups will consider. And also 501c3s will sometimes engage in mutual aid work or like mutual aid work type of work, I guess, through qualified disaster relief payments, which are payments made in connection with like a qualified disaster as recognized by the IRS. At the moment, there's some confusion or like legal questions about the COVID-19 disaster relief window and whether or not nonprofits can like continue to provide these sort of relief payments under that window and when that will stop and like what that looks like. So that's something that nonprofits are engaging in at the moment. And so now that we know some of the basic sort of complications and theory around mutual aid, we're going to go into a brief case study using our local mutual aid. So some of you may know this, but Princeton Mutual Aid was founded in late March of this year by a variety of Princeton community members, and they provide, personalized deliveries and food, and they also do some advocacy work with immigration groups, with tenant organizing and rent organizing, translation services, bike repairs, all these different things that are provided by community members for community members. But they are going through this sort of question of like, okay, we've been doing this work. We are potentially in a situation where we need to like protect ourselves in terms of like liability, like nothing's happened yet, but when something does happen. And also we want to like sustain this. We want to, continue to serve our community, but does this also go against the fundamental tenets of mutual aid? So I wanted to go through some of these things and we can maybe think about our own answers to this question as they are in reality trying to figure this out. Sorry. Okay, cool. So fundraising. As we know, as I pointed out earlier, fundraising for mutual aid looks like solidarity, not charity. Like the people who are giving money are also receiving money, and like it's not like a one-way transfer of funds or resources. And we know that in nonprofit theory, this looks different. There's charity, philanthropy, development. People give strategically based off of corporate interests, tax deduction. In practice, I've spoken to Maya Aronoff, who is a cohort member in our program and also a member of Princeton Mutual Aid. They raise funds through a variety of mechanisms, but they often run out of money. And that is difficult to sort of to figure out what to do with that. And at the same time, they have been successful in getting a good chunk of the members both giving and receiving. And it's not just, some maybe like Princeton students giving to community members and there's like a one-way transfer. So they have been able to achieve that. In terms of governance and decision-making, mutual aid theory says, right, like I said before, consensus decision-making, caring about lots of participation rather than like getting my sort of point of view across. Whereas in nonprofit theory, we know that there are executive leadership, boards. There's this like constant like tension between maybe like the wealth and other things that you can bring to the space and wisdom or like lived experience. And we've talked about concepts like philanthrocapitalism, financialization. What I've learned in practice in Princeton Mutual Aid is that it lacks hierarchy in the ways that nonprofits often do, but does include like a core team of people that handles logistics, votes, and will then present it to the broader body of people at a weekly member meeting that is open to everyone, but doesn't need for there to be necessarily like a certain amount of people there to like vote on decisions. It's just available. And so we can take what we want from that, what is like, is having a small team of people that makes decisions and then gives it to people not in the spirit of mutual aid. Who knows? And then in terms of volunteers, mutual aid is supposed to be deprofessionalized, work is done by volunteers, and like people are passionate about justice. And in nonprofit theory, we know that people have a spectrum of reasons that they are involved in like their volunteer work. And there's different modes of volunteering, different types of volunteering, and often those mimic the nonprofit like staff hierarchies as well. In practice, Princeton Mutual Aid is 100% volunteer run, but that can also lead to like a lack of follow through. I'm going to just put myself out there. I was involved in something and then just sort of backed out around midterms, and so like this is something that they're thinking about, like what does it mean to be 100% volunteer run? Is this sort of like passion about injustice and fighting injustice isn't enough to sustain projects? And then finally, the importance of mission. So in mutual aid theory, it's rooted in these principles of anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, different social justice work, and you evaluate your work by the evaluations of people who are directly impacted by the work, which presumably is also the people who are doing the work, right? It's like all connected. In nonprofit theory, we talk about mission statements serving these different functions, but also centering like donors again, like as a separate sort of like group from maybe people who are served or staff. In practice, this is the mission statement that like below, this is just like verbatim. And I'm not sure, yeah, I'll leave it up to you all in maybe the question time to think about if this meets like nonprofit sort of mission statement goals, mutual aid mission statement goals. So there's that. So, and just, yeah, a note, this is a question that they're currently trying to answer in real life. So this case study doesn't have an answer and it's to be determined. And I encourage folks to get involved and follow through, unlike me. So yeah, I wanted to leave you all with some closing thoughts or reflection questions about the outlook for the future. So is mutual aid the future for nonprofits or vice versa? Will the concept be co-opted? And is it a pandemic-related trend or will it be sustained, especially given the fact that some nonprofits will only be able to engage in mutual aid type activity under like a qualified disaster relief payment structure and window? So I actually don't really know when I started and I wasn't keeping track of time, but I think I have a lot of time.
You're fine. Yeah.
But yeah, that is it.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So we have 20 minutes for Q&A for all three of them. So just keep it to one question so we can get more people in. That's the only rule. Otherwise, whoever you want to ask, go. Because I have like 20 questions already lined up. So if you don't ask. Renee.
I had a question for Brian about accountability. So I'm working on something focusing on churches, and I've kind of hit a tough spot because they're not required to file 1099s. So I can't find any information on whether or not good governance is taking place. So I just wanted to know if you came across anything related to churches and accountability, or how that might be taking place, or your thoughts on that.
Wow, this is a really interesting situation. I didn't find anything on churches specifically. And I wonder, I really don't have a good answer if there's not even paperwork out there for the public. I wonder if it's a good example of where there just isn't a lot of accountability. And you have to hope that, like the direct communication with whoever is leading them would probably be your best bet, but I don't know the situation, but yeah, that might be a really good example of where the system isn't living up to its ability to really regulate things and keep everyone going. Yeah, sorry, I wish I had a bit more to say.
I'll message you, Renee. So, okay. Others, questions? Patrick.
Yeah, I had a question for Clark. First of all, thanks for the presentation. I had been meaning to learn more about mutual aid stuff, so that was really interesting. And I was just curious your thoughts on if Princeton Mutual Aid should become a nonprofit or stay as is, or something else, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I, as someone who is not one of those like 10 people that I mentioned, who's like in the thick of the logistics and like knows about all the small liability opportunities, I'm like, oh yeah, just stay mutual aid. Like, you're fine. We should like be true to like the philosophy of it, like reject the nonprofit industrial complex. But right, like had I, if I was like maybe more involved and saw like, you know, potential issues with like the bank accounts and other things, I might feel differently. I also think that those other options that maybe aren't all the way 501c3, but like fiscal sponsorship might just be like a better place to situate themselves. So they can maybe get somewhat the best of both worlds. That's where I think I would land on it.
Okay, Angela, and then Juan, and then Zach.
Well, it's directed to Clark because she asked a question to us, so I was going to answer that, and it's kind of goes to what Patrick was saying. Yeah, I would think that the mutual aids would eventually become nonprofits for several reasons, but including kind of the one you talked about with your own interests. People's interests fade, and people, you know, go through phases of life, and that's always the problem. Any nonprofit, whether it's a church, you know, Renee was talking about, or, you know, the best nonprofit ever, volunteers are always the problem. So it is really hard to get people to stay that focused and that committed to just one thing. I mean, that's just not really our lifestyle anymore. So reading the case study about the library, no, was it the MOA, the museum? I know that the people that had been involved in it, you know,
Right,
for 30 years, that doesn't happen anymore. I mean, really. And if they are still there, they're tired. They don't want to volunteer anymore. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept and idea, but for the stability, kind of think like where you were leaning, stability, allowing more people to come in and transition out, and I for money accounting purposes, I would tend to think that they would eventually become a formal nonprofit.
okay, Juan?
Angela actually covered what I want to.
Oh, the lawyers jump in.
Yeah, my question is also, what triggered my thought is in the class we talk about the spending like minimum, and actually what happened in reality is 5%, 5.5%. So I don't know if there's a track of record showing mutual aid, how long they can last and how this transformation process is. So I'm just curious on that.
I had the same question, like, are there some old mutual aids that we could look at, you know, and how they structured?
I think there are. I mean, it depends on the model. Like, I think, and the map actually also breaks down like different types of models, but it's like going to be like specific to neighborhood needs. So there's things that are like, yeah, like lending circles, giving circles that are maybe more familiar to people and have like more like common knowledge about how to like sustain them. And then there's like Prince Mutual Aid model, which is like theoretically can always be around if it's like neighbors helping each other. And then there's I didn't get into this, but there are like fraternal benefit societies that are recognized by the IRS. So it depends on like the sustainability, and like what that looks like depends on the specifics of your community, and also like the specific brand of your mutual aid work.
Zach?
Yeah, my question's for Filmon. So just kind of your opinion on this. If we were to end tax benefits to foundations and the rich for their philanthropic giving, would we end up having less social spending? Like, would that public money just get sucked into the federal budget and be spent among all of our priorities? Or would the government be forced to increase its spending on some of these issues that philanthropies currently fund?
Yeah, that's a good question in terms of how the charitable deduction affects the giving behaviors of the hyper wealthy. And from what I could discern, like it affects the charitable behavior of the very, 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 very wealthy. Like I think there was some research in the late 80s around sort of when the Reagan administration was changing taxes. And that, and I think the Reagan administration, it was a bit in the weeds, so I didn't include in the presentation, but like they had removed some of the incentives, not all of them, for making very major big gifts. And then we did see a decline in hyper wealthy, sort of like very major distribution of charitable giving. But then Clinton, I think, reinstated them, I think in the early 90s. So then it went back up. So I think that, so I guess my short answer is that I think for the hyper wealthy, the big major gifts, I think that if you were to remove a lot of the tax incentives, that may shift behavior a little bit. I think just given that sort of anecdotal evidence from like the late 80s, I think, from what I understood in the literature. But in terms of mass philanthropy, like kind of you think like March of the Dimes, that kind of stuff, because most people are taking the standard deduction, sort of taking away the charitable giving probably wouldn't affect sort of like what people are putting in the collection plates or giving to their, like the average Joe is giving to their church or that kind of stuff. So I think the distinction needs to be made between like mass philanthropy versus sort of big donor philanthropy. And those were like, that was a distinction, but I just didn't have enough time in my presentation to sort of draw that distinction. That's why I didn't get into that conversation, what happened in the late 80s and early 90s. But yeah, it's a really good question. And it's sort of hard to tell, but there's definitely going to be a difference between mass philanthropy, the kind of stuff like we would be doing, versus what stuff like Bill Gates would be doing. And I think that the changes in tax policy do have noticeable behavioral changes for the hyper wealthy. I can send you an article about that too, if you're interested more. There was a little bit about it. I just didn't want to get into it in the presentation because it was just too much into the weeds in terms of how the specifics and the different incentives that exist in tax code. Does that answer your question?
Well, I was also wondering like what it would do to total like spending on these issues, like because it's undemocratic for the rich to be able to allocate the funds to whichever pet projects they have. But if we were to just take that money in tax collection, so we just not spend on these issues at all? Or would we spend on it less?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think the big issue is around sort of like, should there be more external review around like why I was like, the particular examples around like Bill Gates and education, in terms of how he's able to sort of marshal a lot of resources around educational resources without a lot of external review. So I wonder if the best way isn't to sort of create a lot of guardrails and restrictions on how people spend their money, because that's probably going to be a difficult sort of legal win. But I think maybe thinking about sort of how do we create accountability structures when they're going into these systems, they're able to marshal a lot of resources to really shape the way education or other sort of sectors operate. I wonder how we can create more accountability systems, set up guardrails for the disproportionate impact of an individual. Sort of, it's a long way of saying I don't really know exactly the answer to your question, but I think that's another way of thinking about it as well. That's the sort of big takeaway, is how do we increase accountability of these big firms rather than how to stop them from doing it. So I don't think the charitable giving deduction is actually the biggest sort of issue. It's that sort of how do we restrain the impact that they have, or how do we make it democratize the impact, because it is public money. How do we make them more accountable is sort of the question I'm thinking about, rather than what do we do to the charitable deduction. Anyways, that's a longer answer to your question, but
thanks.
Emily?
Yeah, thanks for everyone. These were all really interesting presentations. I learned a lot. My question is directed to Brian. I think it's super interesting, kind of the legal recourses you can take. It sounds like there's not a whole lot of options. If you think a nonprofit is like mismanaged your donation or their mission and things like that. So I am curious on a topic probably near and dear to everyone's heart about the infamous Robertson lawsuit, where the Robertsons sued Princeton for mismanaging their donation. And so I'm curious if you're familiar with this, or if like anyone has any kind of, because you suggested maybe putting donors on the board to like maybe mitigate kind of mismanagement issues. And so kind of what you think about donors suing the foundations they put the money on, or like trying to get back money in the gifts, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's super cool. I only know a little about it, so I don't want to like speak for it and get it wrong. But I do wonder if that is an example of the shareholder derivative suit in the nonprofit setting, if they consider themselves stakeholders and sued for that mismanagement. I also wonder there may be contractual issues with their donation if they had a like contingent donation. I don't know. It'd be really interesting to research that because the end result was right that the Princeton had to spend more on students, right? So like something did come of that.
Yeah, and they settled. They paid the Robertsons back like hundreds of millions of dollars.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I can look up the New York Times article and I'll pop it in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. That would be really cool. I wish I thought of that before doing the presentation because that would be an interesting case study to include.
Sorry, how long ago was this?
Very recently. They just came out of the repayment period. They were financially constrained, if you believe it or not. The school was very careful for a while there because of it.
Yeah, the lawsuit I think happened in 2008, right before the recession crashed. And essentially the endowment lost a third of its money. Yeah, and so anyway, there's a lot of politics around it. I will not, say anything I shouldn't say, but I'll like pop the public resource, that you can look up and read in the New York Times.
Okay, that's intriguing. Okay, Galen?
Yeah, my question's for Clark. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I really liked it. I'm going to be talking about immigrant mutual aid societies of a type next week, so that's really related. But I wanted to ask about specifically one of the points that mutual aid is not a disaster relief, like kind of short-term thing. I just kind of wanted to dig in a little bit on that because I saw like in the Princeton mutual aid mission statement, like it mentions COVID-19, like it was started as a response to COVID-19. And I'm kind of curious, like, what's the justification behind having mutual aids like explicitly not be for disasters? Because I think, that could be a really effective use for them. And then maybe they maintain more of like the motivation piece that Angela talked about if they are, for short-term disaster relief. And then that way they don't have to turn into a bureaucratized nonprofit long-term in order to maintain their funding stream. So I wonder if you could dig in on that piece a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I think it was interesting to me too, seeing like how different people defined it. There was definitely some inconsistencies across like different groups or like free resources that were just popping up, right? I don't think there's consensus yet, which is a thing. But I think, so it says mutual aid is not only for disasters or crises. And so I think they acknowledge that like, yes, these things are maybe gonna pop up for that, but it should maybe, or it has the potential to be seen as like a lifestyle or like, just like the way that you like engage with your community, regardless of whether or not you're like in crisis mode. And again, I did feel like there was like a kind of a difference between the theory or like the philosophy behind it and like what people just end up doing in their day-to-day lives. Like you might think more of like, oh, I need to build a relationship with my neighbor when you're like about to be in trouble. But the ideal is maybe that like you already have this relationship, and so that if they're in trouble, you're in trouble, y'all can help each other out. But I hear what you're saying, that they're like leaning more into that and into the reality of how people's lives work could be helpful, not only just like in terms of accessibility, but also, right, like not having to become a nonprofit. Also, Maya said that she's intrigued to hear other people's ideas on what they should do. And if you would like to offer your opinions, she's open to it. And also you can just join Princeton Mutual Aid and express your opinion.
If you're one of the 10. Otherwise you're one of the... We have a couple more minutes if there are any more questions. It doesn't have to be just... Okay. This was a terrific start. 3 really... Oh, I'm sorry, Matt, please go ahead. Yeah, just slow reaction there.
All right, no, it took me a second to get up there. I had a couple of questions, but I think the one that's most burning for me is for Philemon. I loved your presentation. It's so near and dear to, I loved all the presentations, but Philemon's yours is like very near and dear to my own heart. And I really appreciated how you laid out the sort of evolution of philanthropic giving. I may have missed it in your presentation when you were talking about the rise of foundations in the more modern era. But did you in your research focus on the sort of the gospel of wealth sort of motivation and the belief that, you know, that no longer held, but once held, that these titans of industry had a not only, I think you mentioned like a moral obligation, but they were better than all of us because of their accumulation of wealth, and so that was their motivation to sort of be almost like a de facto government agency, and that they would guide society.
Yeah, there was actually a little bit of research I read, like that there was this idea, like a social idea, that because these people had created these wonderful companies, the market had efficiently allocated the resources to them, and that they, you know, market forces had decided that, you know, the money is in their hands essentially, and that they should be the ones deciding who, where, and how this money gets deployed. There was a little bit of that, but in terms of the emergence of it earlier on, it seemed like a lot of it in the early stages wasn't influenced by like, didn't seem like it was influenced by tax policy or things like that. It just seemed like it was genuine sort of altruism combined with desire for prestige, combined with that social influence and power that you get from being able to just wield your money like that. And it seemed like in the earlier periods, like I was talking about, sort of like Gilded Age philanthropy, then early 20th century philanthropy, and then post World War II philanthropy. And it seemed like in the Gilded Age, before there were all these tax incentives, there was still philanthropy going on, big, large philanthropies, like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and that kind of stuff. Russell Sage Foundation, these were all founded before the big tax incentives were put there. And it seems like that's what sort of historians were saying. It was like there was those three elements of like genuine altruism, desire to do good, but then that prestige that comes with it, the social influence that it wields, and there could have been political implications to it as well. But there's just not a lot of information on early foundations as well, and early philanthropy. And that was actually part of that move after after a lot of the investigations in the late 60s. We're like, well, we actually don't know a lot about these organizations and how they operate. So there is a bit of that, but you were talking about that. There is that sort of line of thinking that like market forces, I did see that in some of the articles that I was reading. There's like market forces that allocate the resources to these corporations and these individuals, and that they should be the ones to be deploying these resources. And around the sort of gospel of wealth, there was this really interesting literature around the creation and rise of mass philanthropy. And I think that was really, really interesting, how sort of nonprofits and these foundations began to adopt these business practices and advertising to sort of get more people to sort of donate, and how the expansion of the middle class and like World War II really led to a big rise of sort of mass philanthropy, so households giving money. It was also like, there were also the way that taxes worked back then also were different. So there were actually incentives for people to do that as well. But yeah, so that sort of, I didn't really look at sort of like wealth gospel in terms of like gospel of wealth in terms of like the religious aspects of it, but there was a lot of research on the rise of mass philanthropy as well. And I think that's sort of kind of a lot of what your question is getting at in the 20th century. But yeah, there's just so much information. This is also a topic that's really interesting for me, and so I thought this was really cool. A lot of things to say, but I did see some of that in the literature around sort of like the efficient allocation of resources, and the market forces had directed that to them. So I definitely saw that, but it seemed like that wasn't necessarily like that ideology necessarily wasn't what was driving it. It was mostly sort of like those three factors that I mentioned earlier, and then also like this in the government earlier on, people saw this sort of like almost like one-to-one equivalency spending of like foundation spending and government social spending, and that governments wanted these foundations to keep spending because they thought that if they stopped, then those costs be passed on to government. But then there was that paradigm shift in the 60s that I was talking about. So I think those are mostly the factors. But that ideology of market forces and that kind of stuff, I think that definitely did exist. So that was a really long answer to your question, but yeah.
Clearly, we should get a coffee and keep talking about
Oh,
Yeah,
for
I
sure, definitely.
think so. So again, 3 really terrific presentations and a very good job answering questions. Thank you. I learned a lot actually, and I'm excited to see the other 12. So, okay, so I need 2 volunteers. Philmon, I need 1 more. And Matt. Okay, so you can keep talking. All right. So I am emailing you guys, all of you. Give me 1 second and then check your email. It's gone out. And okay, so you can take a break. Did everybody get their email? Did anybody not get it? Emily, you haven't gotten it yet? Hua and Naomi and Miriam haven't gotten it yet? Okay, try refresh. You got it. Okay, got it. Okay, so I'm take a break, and then you're going to have basically an hour. You are in 2 teams. Let me just finish setting this up because I had to wait for my volunteers here. And I'm going to put you into breakout rooms in those teams. So Matt and Philmon are Connie and her CFO. And they're going to be doing the same thing you're doing, which is getting really comfortable with those financials, the 990 and the annual report, so that they can ask you intelligent questions when you present to them because you're trying to get that contract. So I'm kind of randomly assigning you to one of 2 teams. So when you get the invite, just accept it. And why don't you guys take a break? Let's say 10 minutes. Is that okay? We'll come back to, awesome. Any questions? I'm right here.